My husband secretly took a DNA test on our daughter and it came back negative. He locked me out, but I never cheated. I can't understand how this is happening, and I haven't been able to stop crying all day. My hands are trembling as I hold my phone, reading the paternity test results over and over, willing the words to change. I never cheated on my husband. I never even imagined being with anyone else since we fell in love. We've been together since college, and he's the love of my life. He's so handsome and kind, and I feel lucky every day to have him. Yes, I slept with 2 other people before we got together, but that was long before I committed myself to him. There is absolutely no other potential father for our 5-year-old daughter. We were already married and actively trying for a baby when I got pregnant. I was overjoyed to start our family, and I know he was too. I have been faithful to him every moment of our relationship. I would never, ever cheat on the man I love. But now this stupid test is telling him that our daughter isn't his. It feels like a nightmare that I can't wake up from. He thinks I'm a liar and that our entire relationship is a sham. I keep thinking the test must be wrong, a horrible mistake, but I don't know how to convince him of that. I'm so scared of what this means for us. Over the past few months, it's like my husband has slowly turned into a stranger. He became cold and suspicious in ways I couldn't understand. At first I wondered if he was stressed at work or going through something he couldn't talk about. He started asking to see my phone with no explanation. In the beginning, I handed it over without a second thought, hoping to ease whatever worries he had. But he kept asking again and again, and I finally had to put my foot down and tell him I wouldn't keep giving him my phone unless he told me why. It hurt that he didn't trust me, and it was frustrating not knowing what was fueling his behavior. He also grew distant with our daughter, which broke my heart. She's a bright and loving little girl who adores her father, and suddenly he was pulling away from both of us. He would spend hours shut away in his home office, emerging only to grab a meal or slip into bed without a word. I had no idea what he was doing in there or what was running through his mind. I remember lying awake at night beside him, feeling the distance between us even though we were inches apart. I did not cheat on him, yet somehow he was looking at me like I was a betrayer. It was as if a cloud of unspoken accusations hung in the air, growing thicker each day. The confrontation finally came this morning, and it was explosive. He came downstairs with a piece of paper clenched in his hand and a storm in his eyes. I was in the kitchen making breakfast for our daughter when he thrust the paper at me, his hand trembling. His voice was icy and strange as he told me he had done a paternity test on our little girl. My stomach dropped and my heart pounded in my chest, because I knew instantly that nothing good would come from this. Before I could even ask why, he accused me point blank of betraying him. He said the test proved that our daughter isn't biologically his. I was so stunned I could hardly breathe. I remember my hands going numb and the sound of the spatula I had been holding clattering onto the floor. I stood there in the middle of our kitchen, completely in shock, trying to process his words. He was furious and hurt, yelling that he knew I had cheated on him and made a fool of him. He demanded that I leave the house immediately. I could barely speak, but I managed to choke out that I have never cheated, that the test had to be wrong. I was pleading with him, my voice cracking, begging him to listen. He wouldn't hear any of it. He cut me off, saying he had evidence in his hand and that my lies had finally caught up to me. In his rage, he shouted that he realized something was off when he noticed our daughter has brown eyes even though we both have blue. He kept jabbing his finger at that sheet of paper as if it were some verdict of my guilt. I was sobbing and trying to get him to calm down, but he was too far gone in anger and pain. When I refused to leave, still desperately insisting that we could talk this through, he spun on his heel and stormed down the hallway. A second later, I heard the sharp slam of our bedroom door. I followed him, still crying, and found that he had locked me out of our bedroom. I pounded on the door, desperation rising in my chest, but through the door he told me to just go away. In that moment, I felt utterly helpless. With nowhere else to go, I stumbled into our daughter's room and collapsed onto her small bed. I clutched one of her stuffed animals and sobbed into it, my whole body shaking. A few minutes later, I heard the soft patting of little feet. My daughter appeared in the doorway, her brown eyes wide with concern as she saw Mommy crying. I hurriedly wiped my tears and sat up, forcing a shaky smile. I didn't want to scare her. She asked me what was wrong, and I could barely find the words. I just told her that I was upset but that it wasn't her fault, and that I would be okay. My voice sounded false even to my own ears. I gently urged her to go play in the living room and promised I would be out in a little while. Once she left, I closed the door and slid down to the floor, pressing my back against it as if I could physically barricade myself from the terrible reality outside. This is terrifying. My whole world is crashing down around me, and I have never felt so alone. What should I do? Later that day, after endless hours of tension and silence, my husband finally emerged from our bedroom. My eyes were swollen from crying and I was exhausted, but I knew I had to try to reach him. Our daughter was in the living room watching cartoons, giving us a moment to talk alone. He looked as if he'd been through a war, his face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. I realized he must have been crying too. We stood facing each other in the hallway, uncertain and aching. I swallowed the lump in my throat and quietly told him again that I have never cheated on him. I promised that I would do anything to prove my innocence, anything to fix this. I even mentioned that I had started making a list of possible tests or experts we could consult to figure out what went wrong with the paternity test. I spoke carefully, trying not to sound accusatory or desperate, just earnest. He closed his eyes and shook his head, saying he didn't want to talk about tests or plans right now. He still seemed overwhelmed and not ready to consider that the test could be false. But then, in a strained voice, he added that he still loves our daughter. He said no matter what the paper claims, he was there when she was born and has been her dad every day since. Hearing him say that brought me to tears again, but this time it was out of relief. At least he wasn't rejecting her. He also mumbled that he wouldn't make me leave our home or lock me out of our room for now, not until we figured things out properly. That was his version of an apology, and I gratefully accepted it. Tentatively, I reached out and took his hand. He let me. I asked him softly if he could please just hold me. For a moment he hesitated, and I was afraid he would say no, but then he gave a small nod. He wrapped his arms around me and I wrapped mine around him, and we just stood there clinging to each other. I buried my face in his shoulder and cried quietly, and I felt his hand gently stroke my back. The embrace was both heart-wrenching and comforting, so familiar yet so fragile. When we finally pulled apart, he looked at me with such sadness in his eyes. He said we would talk more tomorrow after we had both gotten some rest. That night, I lay in our bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, too anxious to sleep. I was terrified that I might never be able to convince him of the truth. I just wanted our family to go back to the way it was before this nightmare. How can I be a good wife to him now, when he is in so much pain, and still find a way to prove my innocence? It felt like an impossible task, but I knew I had to try. The next day, despite my exhaustion, I was determined to fight for my family and clear my name. My husband and I sat down together and cautiously discussed what to do next. I showed him the list of tests and plans I had made, going through each suggestion I'd researched. He was still guarded, but he agreed that we needed to investigate further. I could tell he wasn't ready to fully trust me yet. His eyes were downcast and his voice flat, but at least he was willing to take steps. In a low voice, he warned me that if every new test somehow proved I was lying, he would go scorched earth on our marriage. Hearing him say that sent a chill through me, but I managed to nod. I understood he was hurt and trying to protect himself. I also knew his threat would never come to pass because I had not betrayed him, and I was determined to prove it. So we proceeded with the plan. That week, we scheduled appointments at a reputable lab for new DNA tests. Both of us had our blood drawn, and we also had our daughter's blood drawn, to do a formal paternity test and even a maternity test for me. We wanted to leave no room for error or doubt. Waiting for those results was absolute agony. Each day that passed with us in limbo felt heavier than the last. We tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for our little girl, getting her to school, making dinner, reading bedtime stories, but it was like we were walking through a fog. My husband was civil but distant. We communicated only about practical things. Every night I could feel the tension in his body as we lay in the same bed, an invisible wall between us despite our physical closeness. In the quiet hours of the night, I would stare at the ceiling and go over every possible scenario in my head. I started researching like crazy, looking up anything that could explain how a paternity test might be wrong. That's when I learned about a rare condition called chimerism. In extremely uncommon cases, a person can have two sets of DNA in their body. I read about a woman who needed to prove her maternity and discovered that the DNA in her blood was different from the DNA in her reproductive organs. It was a long shot, but it was one of the only medical explanations I could find that might cause a biological parent to not match their own child on a genetic test. Clinging to that sliver of hope, I even made an appointment with a genetic specialist who had experience with chimerism. It was something to hold on to while we awaited the test results. After several torturous days, the lab called us in to discuss the results. My husband and I drove to the facility together in tense silence, both of us bracing for whatever we were about to learn. We sat in a small conference room as a doctor gently explained the findings. The paternity test confirmed once again that my husband is not genetically related to our daughter. My husband closed his eyes when he heard that, a mixture of resignation and sorrow on his face. Then the doctor quietly added that the maternity test showed that I am not genetically related to our daughter either. I felt the world tilt sideways. A ringing started in my ears and I could barely process what was being said. I remember whispering that this couldn't be right, that there must be a mistake, but the doctor shook her head with a sympathetic look. I felt my husband's hand grip mine under the table as I began to tremble. Neither of us had expected this. We had been so focused on the idea that something was wrong with the test regarding my husband that it never dawned on us that I could also not be a match. Tears blurred my vision. I thought about the day our daughter was born, how I held her against my chest, exhausted and elated, believing she was our flesh and blood. It was inconceivable that the child I gave birth to was not the one we brought home. I broke down sobbing right there in the office, and my husband looked as if he might faint. The doctor gave us a moment to collect ourselves and then gently said what we were already beginning to realize. It appeared that our baby and another baby had been switched at birth. Shock, anger, and fear all washed over me in an instant. My husband held me as I cried, his own tears falling silently. In that moment, all of his distrust was gone. This was proof I had been faithful, but it came at a price neither of us ever imagined. We left the lab in a daze, with documents in hand confirming what we had been told. As soon as we got to the car, we knew we had to act. We called the hospital where I had delivered our baby and urgently explained what happened. The hospital administrators were stunned. They promised to look into it, but we weren't going to wait passively. We drove straight to the local police department and filed an official report. Within a day, a detective and a hospital representative came to our home to take detailed statements from us. I recounted every memory of my pregnancy and the delivery, trying to recall anything that might have been amiss. My husband explained how this whole ordeal had unfolded, from his initial suspicions and the secret tests to our ultimate, shocking discovery. The police assured us they would investigate and try to locate our biological child and the other family involved. We also contacted a lawyer to begin the process of suing the hospital for this unimaginable mistake. Those days were a blur of anxiety and disbelief. I would find myself drifting into a daze, then snapping back to reality and realizing I had been sitting and staring at the wall, completely lost in thought about our babies. I had my husband back by my side, but our world was in chaos. Since learning the truth, I haven't been able to sleep through the night without being near my daughter. Every night, I end up in her room. I watch her as she drifts off to sleep, brushing her soft hair from her face, and I often stay. Sometimes I curl up around her, holding her close as if my presence can somehow keep her mine. I'm terrified that one day soon someone will show up and take her away from me. Legally, I don't even know what could happen. Could the other family claim her, since she's their biological child? Could a court force us to trade children? These thoughts torment me constantly. I try to push them away and just focus on loving her every second I can. No matter what any test says, she is my daughter in every way that matters. I have been the one to kiss her goodnight, to bandage her scraped knees, to hear her call me mommy and tell me she loves me. The bond one have with her is unbreakable. And yet, I also find myself lying awake thinking about the child I never got to know. Somewhere out there, my biological daughter took her first steps and spoke her first words without me. I wonder if she has our blue eyes. I wonder if she has a favorite teddy bear or if she likes to sing. I wonder if she is safe and loved. I pray every night that she is okay, and that her other parents have cherished her just as we have cherished the girl we raised. It breaks my heart that I couldn't be there for her for these first 5 years. I have to believe we will find her soon. I already love her, even though we haven't met. My heart now somehow has to hold love for 2 children, the daughter I raised and the daughter I never knew I had. I feel immense guilt even thinking it, but a part of me almost wishes we had never uncovered this truth. If we had never known, we would have continued as a happy family, never the wiser. Of course, that would mean another family would still be raising a child that isn't actually theirs, and our real daughter would still be away from us. It's a selfish thought born out of fear. We needed to know the truth, but that truth has shattered so much of what we thought we knew about our lives. Now we have to live with it and make the best of this impossible situation. So far, we haven't told our daughter anything about the mix-up. At her age, she wouldn't understand, and it would only upset and confuse her. For now, we simply tell her that mommy and daddy are dealing with a grown-up problem but that we both love her more than anything. We also agreed not to tell anyone else in our personal lives until we know more. We don't want gossip or a media circus. Our friends and neighbors just know we're going through something tough, and they've respectfully given us space. I dread the thought of anyone treating our daughter differently because of this. She is an innocent little girl and does not deserve to be the subject of whispers or stares. If and when we find our biological child and the other family, I have no idea how we will handle it. Late at night, I lie awake imagining various outcomes. In one hopeful scenario, both families come together for the sake of the children. I picture us finding a way to raise the girls almost like sisters, ensuring they both feel loved by all of their parents. Maybe we could all move into a big house or at least live nearby so neither child has to be taken away from the only parents they've ever known. It sounds idealistic and perhaps impractical, but it's a comforting thought that no one would lose their daughter completely. In other moments, darker fears take hold. I worry the other parents might want to keep their biological child and also keep the child I raised, effectively taking both girls away. Or what if they don't want to cooperate with us at all? The possibilities are endless and frightening. We are treading in uncharted territory. I looked online for any support groups or stories similar to ours and found almost nothing useful. Cases of babies switched at birth are so rare, and the few I did find were turned into sensational news stories. It made me feel even more isolated. The question of when and how to tell our daughter about this weighs on me too. She is too young now to understand, but we can't keep it a secret from her forever. Someday, whether it is years from now or sooner if circumstances demand it, we will have to sit her down and explain that a mistake was made when she was born. I have no idea how to have that conversation. How do you tell a child that the life you gave her was based on an error, even though every bit of love was real? All of these uncertainties and fears swirl in my mind day after day. Sometimes I break down and cry, asking what we did to deserve this. Why did this nightmare happen to us, to our family? We were so happy, and it all came crashing down through no fault of our own. It feels so unfair. Through this ordeal, the one thing that has kept me going is that my husband and I have truly found our way back to each other emotionally. In the aftermath of the revelation, once the initial shock began to settle, we had a long, honest talk. Late one night, after our daughter was asleep, we sat together on the couch and he opened up to me completely. He told me how sorry he was for doubting me and treating me the way he did. I could see the shame and regret in his eyes. I held his hand and listened as he poured out months of bottled-up fear and insecurity. He explained that after the pandemic and some tough times at work, he hadn't been in a good place emotionally. His self-esteem had plummeted, he felt older, out of shape, and not good enough for me. Meanwhile, he said, I seemed to have everything together, which made him afraid I would realize I had settled for less. These dark thoughts led him to an online forum where men shared stories of cheating wives and broken marriages. Instead of finding help, he found a chorus of voices that amplified his worst fears. He read stories of women betraying their husbands and taking the kids and the house, and it slowly poisoned his mind with suspicion. When he came across a comment about eye color and infidelity, how two blue-eyed parents shouldn't have a brown-eyed child, he felt a chill. That was exactly our situation. It was like a switch flipped in his mind. Suddenly, things that were perfectly innocent took on a sinister meaning for him. He became convinced there might be hidden signs of betrayal in my behavior. That was when he started checking my phone, looking for evidence that didn't exist. When he found nothing, instead of easing his mind, it somehow made him more suspicious, because those online strangers had warned that cheaters are good at hiding their tracks. He told me he thought he was losing his sanity during that period. Finally, he ordered the paternity test, secretly hoping it would prove him wrong and put his fears to rest. When it came back saying he wasn't the father, he was absolutely devastated. He described it as feeling like the ground had vanished beneath his feet. Still, a part of him hoped it was a mistake, which is why he ordered a second test. But when that one also came back negative, he felt he had no choice but to believe I had betrayed him in the worst way. His reaction was to lash out in anger and pain. He admitted that in that moment, he wanted to hurt me the way he felt hurt. He wanted me gone because he thought I'd been lying to him every day of our lives. As he spoke, tears welled up in his eyes. He squeezed my hand as if he feared I would disappear. I had tears in my eyes too, listening to how much anguish he had been in all that time. When he finished, I told him I was grateful for his honesty. I also told him I forgave him. He broke down crying then, and I held him. I understood that his actions came from fear and heartbreak, not malice. Neither of us could have imagined the real explanation for our daughter's parentage. He kept saying I was being too good to him, that he didn't deserve my understanding, but I shushed him and said we had both been through a nightmare. We stayed up late, holding each other, both apologizing for the pain we had experienced. In the end, I don't see my husband as a monster or a villain in this story. He is a good man who was led astray by his own insecurities and some terrible outside advice. If anything, this experience has shown us how deeply we love each other and how much we both want to protect our family. I assured him that I have never for a second stopped finding him attractive and admirable, and it hurt me that he ever thought so little of himself. I love him more than words can say, and I know he loves me too. We have vowed that no matter what happens with our daughters and the other family, we will face it together. Our marriage has been tested in the most surreal way imaginable, and we came frighteningly close to losing everything. But we have emerged on the other side stronger and more united. There are still many uncertainties ahead, and I am still scared about what the future holds. Even so, when I feel my husband's arms around me and hear our daughter laughing in the next room, I know that we will not let this break us. Whatever challenges come, we will meet them as a family, with love and honesty, and that gives me the strength to keep going.